Okay, so when we get started here, the first thing we're going to have is a little history lesson. My favorite. But before I do that, I do want to sort of preface with what you need to know. So from this history lesson, you want to be able to give us a broad timeline of political party history in this country. That's over time, who were the parties that were against one another? Vaguely speaking, which of those two pairs of parties was the party that was in favor of more government stuff, and which one wanted government to do less stuff? And then we're going to talk about some major realigning elections or events which cause those big shifts. So being able to identify, okay, so why do we move from one thing to another? Well, there's going to be an event that happens. Okay, so that's kind of the outline of where we're going. So A pushers, I'm going to count on you a little bit here. We're going to begin with in the beginning, not the biblical sense, the George Washington sense. In the beginning, how many parties were there? There were 0. But very quickly after George Washington left office, after telling us specifically don't form parties, what do? We form parties, and what are those two parties, the first two parties? Good, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Which of those two parties was the party of more government? The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans were the party of less government. Okay? They're going to fight each other for a while. There's a major realigning election in the year 1800. A realigning election in the year 1800. So what does it mean to realign? Yep. Yeah, so the way that we align is the way that we decide to arrange ourselves, who's with one party and who's with another. So a realigning election is going to be an election in which we see a big shift in terms of where people group themselves. The election of 1800, I don't think fits the strictest definition of realigning election, but the College Board says it's a realigning election. So here's what happens. Well, you tell me what happens in 1800. Well, Jefferson's elected, right? In 1800, Jefferson is elected, and the reason that's important is because we shift from the Federalist Party, which had been in control of the government. So the Democratic Republicans had existed, but they hadn't been the majority or they had the presidency. So we shift from the Federalist Party being in control of government, being the majority, to now in 1800, the Democratic Republicans take over the majority. They take over both houses of Congress, and they take over the presidency. So the realignment is we sort of see the majority balance shift in favor of the Democratic Republicans. But we still have the same two-party system, Federalists versus Democratic Republicans. It doesn't last very long, though, because after the War of 1812, I heard someone say Hartford Convention. That's APUSH stuff. You don't have to know that for AP government. But the War of 1812 happens. The Federalists take the wrong side. And as a result, what happens to the Federalist Party? It dies. So for a very short period of time, and for the only time in our nation's history, we have a one-party system. And that one party is the Democratic Republicans. And it's called the era of good feelings. Doesn't that sound nice? The era of good feelings. One tiny little chunk of history, we have a one-party system as Democratic Republicans. But pretty quickly, we get a new polarizing figure. His name is Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson is going to make so many people angry that we see the formation of a new second party, and it's the Whigs. So after a brief period of this era of good feelings, now we're back to the two-party system. And the Democrats are going to, or the Democratic Republicans are going to shorten their name. They're going to become the Democrats versus the Whigs. Okay? So Democratic Republicans versus Federalists. Then just the Democratic Republicans for a while during the era of good feelings. And after Jackson, we've got the Democrats and the Whigs. Of those two parties, which party was for more government? The Whigs. Good. The Whigs. The Whigs were the party of Henry Clay. They wanted the American system, the government to get involved, all that business. And the Democrats under Jackson want the government to leave the states alone and let them do what they want to do. This lasts for a little while until the next major realigning election, which happens in 1860. So in 1860, we see the next major realigning election. Who's elected? It is Abraham Lincoln. And when Abraham Lincoln is reelected, what's the realignment? What has changed? Well, what's his party? He's a Republican. So we create basically a new party. The Whigs had essentially fallen apart about 5 or 6 years before. They couldn't figure out a good answer to the question of slavery, because, like, what is a good answer to the question of slavery, to be honest? Abolition is a good answer. End slavery. End slavery. Okay, not owning human beings. Good plan. Anyway, the Whigs couldn't figure out one that they thought was politically feasible, I guess I should say. They kind of dissolved. And so in 1860, a whole bunch of sort of like floating around different unorganized groups come together. They support Abraham Lincoln as the Republican candidate for president. And now we see a new second party. So we've got the Democrats and now the Republicans. Okay, so to repeat, what was the realignment in 1860? Well, Lincoln's elected. What's the realignment? Republican Party forms, right? People reorganize themselves and we get a new party, the Republican Party, to replace the Whigs, which had kind of fallen apart. Okay, so now we've got a Democrats and Republicans. Woohoo! We don't have to change parties anymore. But they're going to flip-flop sides, so let's hold tight for a little while. So we go on for 1860 for a while, and generally speaking, the Republican Party is the party of more government, right? As in, like, don't be mean to former slaves and, like, build the economy. And the Democrats are still the party of get off my back, government, leave us alone. Which will last until the next major realigning election of 1932. And in 1932, some changes had happened in the 1920s. The Republican Party had become the party of bigger business. They'd begun to make some arguments. But anyway, the Republicans had still been mostly laissez-faire, right, throughout the 1920s. But in 1932, the Great Depression happens. Well, it happens in 1929. And who was elected in 1932? FDR is elected. And what is FDR promising? Yeah, he wants a new deal. He says the government's going to do stuff. So now all of a sudden the Democrats, which had been kind of like, the government should leave us alone, you know, like get off of our backs, and the Republicans have kind of been like, the government should direct the economy. Now the Democratic Party is going to say, no. The government needs to get involved in a big way, not just direct the economy through monetary policy, but get involved on an active, everyday. They're going to really sort of change their message. So the first thing that happens in 1932 is the Democratic Party begins to adopt the idea that the government should be involved. Okay, which is going to gradually push the Republican Party to be the party of less government over time. But the next and probably most important thing that happens in 1932 is that the Democratic coalition shifts. What's a coalition? If I have a coalition, what do I have? A group of people who support me, right? If this is my coalition, these are the group of people that support me. So the second and most important thing that happens in the 1932 election is that the Democratic coalition expands. Before 1932, the Democrats had been the party of the South, because not the party of Lincoln, and the party of tiny farmers. Do they have a majority? They do not. But in 1932, FDR in his message expands the Democratic coalition. Now they've got industrial workers, they've got city dwellers, they've got major traders and commercial people. They've got many of the banks in some cases who believe that, banking people who believe that the government should get involved. And African Americans are going to begin to shift their vote to the Democratic Party, which is a big deal because since the Civil War, where African Americans could vote, which, yay, racism was not very many places, African Americans were voting for the party of Lincoln, the Republican Party, right? But 1932 begins the shift. African American voters begin to favor the Democratic Party. They vote for FDR, and they vote for him in a big way 4 years later. So 1932, two big things. The Democratic Party begins to embrace the idea that the government should get involved and do a bunch of stuff in the economy. And, more importantly, the Democratic coalition expands significantly to include pretty much everybody except for big businessmen. The next major realigning election is going to come in 1968. So it's the last realigning election. 1968. And in 1968, anybody know who gets elected? It's Nixon. Nixon gets elected. I'm not sure many people would begin Richard Nixon with good old, but okay. So Richard Nixon is elected, and he uses something called the Southern Strategy, which is code word racism. But the Southern Strategy effectively finishes this shift to the modern party coalitions. Nixon said it begins to embrace religious conservative voters, people who think that the hippies need to just take a bath and get a job, He begins to embrace white segregationist voters. He talks about things like local choice, which is code word for segregation. And in doing so, we see the South, which even in the FDR days had still been solidly Democratic. The South will shift and become solidly Republican. And we'll also begin to see some drawing off of that giant, like, monolithic Democratic coalition, right? These religious voters who previously had been kind of like pro-Great Society people, had been supportive of some of the like Democratic reforms, now are going to find themselves more at home in the Republican Party. So we'll begin to see the like decline, the gradual decline of that giant Democratic coalition. So 1968 then is the year in which we can say that like today's modern parties really begin, right? Because now the Republican Party is the party of get off of our backs, let the government stay away from our businesses. And the Democratic Party becomes the party of mostly lower income, urban dwellers, and minorities who are going to be arguing the government should help step in and make things more equal, should get involved in the economy. And the last thing I'll say about 1968 is that if the Democratic coalition is sort of being siphoned off of, or having some of their people siphoned away, then we're going to see a more equal division, right, between Democrats and Republicans. You know, from the New Deal until the 1960s, the Democratic Party had a pretty strong advantage, right? They controlled pretty much every single election except for Eisenhower, and he saved the entire free world, so I guess we can, like, understand why he would have won. So, but now all of a sudden, the Southern strategy has begun to, like, change that balance. So the next thing we want to associate with 1968 is the beginning of the era of divided government. The beginning of the era of divided government. And the definition of divided government is when Congress is controlled, when at least one house of Congress, is controlled by one party, and the president is controlled by the other. So if the president is Republican, and the Senate is Republican, and the House is Democratic, is that divided government? If the president is Republican, the Senate is Republican, and the House is Democratic, is that divided government? Yes. If the House is Republican, and the Senate is Republican, and the president is Democratic, is that divided government? Yes. So if both houses are controlled by the same party and the president is an opposite party, that's also divided government. But if all three are controlled by the same party, if the Senate, House, and presidency are controlled by the Democratic Party, is that divided government? No. So again, divided government means at least one house of Congress is controlled by a party other than the president. Yeah? So again, 1968, Nixon, the Southern strategy, we see the South shift to the Republican Party, and we see conservative religious voters shifting to the Republican Party. This means we have a more even split between the two parties, demographically speaking, which is going to help usher in the era of divided government, where more often than not, we see at least one house of Congress controlled by a party that is not the same party as the president. So I want you to take about 2 minutes, and at your tables, I want you to find a partner. If you're in a group of 3, you can go in threes. And what I want you to do is to see if you can recreate that timeline of American political parties. So somebody will start, I'll start for you actually. In the beginning, there were no parties. Then the next person's going to say, okay, well, next there were these two parties, and then something happened. And then you'll switch, and the next person will say, okay, and then this thing happened. It's important, please, to me, that you don't let one person just tell the whole story, because I want to test everybody trying to recall what did you get. You can look at your notes if you need to. It's not a test. But just see how much you can sort of go through the story on your own. About 2 minutes, go. This is not partners. This is a giant group. You two be partners, and you two be partners, and you two be partners. Who are we talking about? That's right. At the end of the War of 1812. I mean, there were several presidents during the Year of Good Feeling. So the Hartford Convention happens during the presidency of Madison. So then the end of Madison, and Monroe, and then Quincy Adams. 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Back to me, please. So hopefully we have an idea of some major things that cause big party shifts. Let's just do a couple of quick ones. Please don't say it out loud, but raise your hand if you think you could tell me what is the realignment that happens after 1932. If you think you could tell me, I won't call on you. I just want to know who thinks they know the answer. What is the realignment that occurs in or after 1932? Okay, what party is it? Democratic Party, and what is the realignment? Yeah, the coalition expands, right? Lots of people come to the fold of the Democratic Party. Okay, raise your hand if you think you could tell me the thing that the realignment that happens in the election of 1860. I was going to say it a different way, sorry. Raise your hand if you think you could tell me the realignment that happens in the election of 1860. Hands down. What's the party? And the realignment is that it exists, right? It forms. Good. Raise your hand if you think you could tell me the name of the political party that opposed the Whigs. You could tell me the name of the political party that opposed the Whigs. Okay, what is it? The Democrats, right? That's the party of Jackson that will then continue on. Anyway, so you don't have to know a huge amount of detail about all this history, but being able to identify these major realigning elections, who are the parties that oppose one another, and what happens in the realignment. So let's take a quick, or another quick break, and I want us to think about, this is one piece of a free response question from, I don't know, 6 years ago or something. And I went like this. It says, explain how divided government has contributed to the decline in trust and confidence in government. Be sure to include a definition of divided government in your response. So what I'd like you to do is in your notebooks, just try to answer this piece of this question. So start with the easy part, the definition, divided government is, and then see if you can sort of figure out, why do you think that divided government would contribute to a decline in trust and confidence in the government? Okay, so first of all, somebody remind me, what is the definition of divided government? Okay, Drew? Good. So when at least one house of Congress is controlled by a party different from the president. Now, hopefully, you are recognizing that for this question, to get the second point, or the first point about how this could lead to the lack of trust in government, you have to explain how whatever it is that you say causes us to not trust the government is related to divided government. So can somebody give me an example? Why would divided government cause us not to trust the government? Okay? Sure, so it leads to gridlock, right? Two different parties control the government. It's hard for them to come to an agreement, so a lot of stuff isn't going to get done. And that can cause people to feel like the government isn't living up to its promises. You told me you were going to pass this law, you didn't get it done. I think that's a great explanation. The best part being that it tells us specifically why does it have to do with two different parties controlling the government. Can we think of another example? Gridlock is like the easiest, sort of low-hanging fruit here, but there's like at least one more big one. Did you all put the same thing? Yes?
Maybe it's like people might feel that they
Yep.
Maybe if they are able to pass legislation and kind of just like repeat the rules doing something, it's not doing something done by the party.
Maybe that would actually, I think, be more common if we had periods of vacillating unified government, which is not the same thing as having divided government. Well, not exactly. So the first 2 years of President Obama's presidency and at least the first 2 years of President Trump's presidency had been unified government, but that's not really the norm. Like, the norm is that generally speaking we have divided government. So we don't normally go from Democratic unified government to Republican unified government. It's like there's divided government in the middle. Does that make sense? So I don't think that you're wrong, but I think that gets into something that's more complicated than just divided government. The other big question or issue that I want you to think about is, do you think that government gets more civil when we have divided government? Are they nicer to each other? Do they say nice things about the other party? So just the rise of negativity, again, because there's this competition, because nothing is really getting done, what ends up getting done is a bunch of name calling, right? And the rise of like anti-other party rhetoric as a result tends to make people feel bad. We just don't like the government. We think that they're just a bunch of little kids in a sandbox sort of thing. So, okay. This is a quick review that I sort of put together since we talked about the three pieces of the parties in government, or the party in government, the party in electorate, and the party organization. This isn't any new information, but I did want you to get a sense of, like, it's still one party. Like, we still call it the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. So we need to know that they are not unified, that there is a lot of fragmentation that exists. But all the pieces work together, as you can see on this slide. So, like, the party in government or party organization helps to elect the party in government, right? They provide funds, they help organize campaigns, they do all of that. In return, they are hoping that the party in government is going to like pass policies that are related to the platform. Sounds like a pretty good trade. But remember that at the same time, the party and the electorate are the ones who are actually casting votes for those people in government. I think that President Trump's election in 2016 is a really good example of what's going on here. Did the Republican Party like what President Trump was proposing? No, they were horrified. I mean, there was conversation even in the week before the Republican National Convention that they wanted to try to figure out a way to not nominate Trump, right? The Republican committee, the Republican Party organization did not want Trump because they felt like he wasn't going to follow literally their party line. He didn't think that he was going to follow the platform. But was Trump listening to the Republican Party? No, because who has more significance? The people who actually do the voting, right? The party organization is helpful. They give us money, cool, and they might help with the campaign. But fundamentally, it's the voters that are going to make the difference. And so President Trump, then candidate Trump, was focusing on what he believed he had tapped into, and it turned out he had, a significant group of people within the Republican Party who were unhappy with the existing platform, and he won as a result. So we want to remember that the party electorate actually sometimes has more sway than this like organized party leadership might have. And so on. So just kind of thinking about how each of these pieces interact is what this is about. This graph just really highlights some of the same issues that you guys brought up when we looked at those charts, that had who identified Republican and Democrat. And a lot of you were like, well, everybody pretty much identifies as Democrat with a few small exceptions. But remember that even though that poll, that data you were looking at, was taken beginning December 2016. So it's obviously not true that there are significantly more Democrats in the country than Republicans, because Republicans won the election across the board, right? House, Senate, lots of state legislatures, the governorships, like the presidency, all of those things. So this really helps us to see. So this decline in people identifying as Republicans corresponds with an increased number of people identifying as independents, right? And the best guess is that really since the war in Iraq, and more broadly since President Obama's election, that the Republican Party has been increasingly fractured. And so although there are still consistent Republican voters who are regularly voting for people who say that they are Republicans, that more and more Republican voters are saying, well, actually, I'm libertarian, or, well, I'm a business conservative, or I'm a religious voter, or whatever, and that then these individual groups are just less likely to identify with the party as a whole. Overall, in terms of the number of voters, depending upon which year we're talking about, generally speaking, we have a roughly even number of Democratic and Republican voters. It depends on how turnout looks. It depends on what the major issues are of the day. But there's no huge numerical advantage to one party over the other, whereas like in 1936, there was a huge advantage, right? There were way more Democrats in the country than there were Republicans as a result of that giant New Deal coalition. We don't see that today. Okay, so we're going to talk about a couple of pretty big things. This is the major characteristics of U.S. parties. And to start with, I guess I can give you the outline version, which is that the major characteristics are that we have a two-party system, that the parties are fragmented. Remember our little triangles. And finally, that the parties are polarized. And what we want to talk about is what are the structural issues that cause those things? Like, what are the structures of U.S. government that cause us to have a two-party system? So what does it mean that we have a two-party system? Well, what it means is that the minor parties are not going to win. Not ever. They're just not. Not even Jill Stein. Now, it doesn't mean, as you can see from our party history lesson, that there will always and forever be the Republican and the Democratic Party. Because something could easily happen that one of those two parties could kind of fall apart and a new party could emerge, take its place. That's entirely possible. Might happen in the next half century or whatever. Like, that's possible. But there will always be two major parties. And if you're not one of the two major parties, your chances of winning national office are approximately 0. Okay? That's what it means to say we have a two-party system. But why? But why do we have a two-party system? And the biggest structural reason we have a two-party system, there's tradition, like you identify the way your parents did. There's all kinds of things. But the biggest structural reason that we have a two-party system is the fact that we use single-member districts. Single-member districts. Now, you're going to sort of have to cross your eyes and be like, well, duh, Mrs. Rodriguez, that's how elections work. But I'll explain later about how that's not how all elections work. Single-member districts in this country mean that for every district, every little location, we're electing just one person. You get it? Single-member districts. But the thing about electing just one person is that what if I get 49.9% of the vote? How much of that seat do I get? 0. No. If I get 49.9% of the vote, and the other person gets 50.1% of the vote, they get all of the seat because it's just one seat, right? And I get nothing. So you can see how, and then so here in this example, let's say that in this district, the district was 40% Republican, 30% Democrat, and 30% Libertarian. That's a huge turnout for the Libertarian Party, right? A third party could get really strong. It can deny the Republican Party the majority. They can't get the majority. But the other thing up here, the asterisk, is plurality wins. This is true in almost every place in the country. There are a few states, Louisiana is one of them, that require by law that you have to win a majority. So in Louisiana, if you don't win the majority, so if you don't get at least 50% of the vote, then you have to have a runoff. The top 2 vote getters have a runoff. They have another election to decide who's actually going to win. But that's not true in most of the country. Almost everywhere, the plurality wins. So even though the Libertarian Party was able to get 30% of the vote to deny the majority of the Republicans, did they get anything? No, the Republican still wins with 40% of the vote. So this is Colorado, because I couldn't draw Texas. And let's pretend that Colorado gets 20 seats in the U.S. legislature, in the House of Representatives. So we have single-member districts, so we would draw how many districts? 20 of them. And let's pretend that every district looks like this. How many seats would the Republicans control? 20, 100% of them. How many seats would the Democrats control? 0, 0%. And the Libertarians? 0. So again, you can see that single member districts are going to discourage third parties, because the only way to win is to win, right? The only way to get anything is to have the most votes. So even if minor parties can get significant numbers of votes, they're not going to get any prize. They don't get any representation. So they're discouraged, because who wants to vote for the Libertarian Party when voting for them is not going to help you to get a candidate or to get any representation? You would end up siding with one of the other two pieces. But so you're all going, well, duh, that's how elections work. So let's take a moment to talk about how elections could work. And most European democracies, they don't use single member districts. They use something called proportional representation. Proportional representation, sometimes they're called multi-member districts. And the way proportional representation works is kind of like this. So let's pretend it's the same state, Colorado, they still need 20 seats. Instead of making 20 districts, they would make, let's say, 2. And if there's 2 districts, then each district is going to elect 10 people. Right? There's two districts. We need 20 people. Each district gets to elect 10 people. So as a result, if this district looks like this, how many Republicans are going to win? 4. Democrats? Or Libertarians? Exactly. You can see how in proportional representation, minor parties would be encouraged. Because so long as you get that minority threshold of the vote, 10%, you still get a seat. You still get representation. And in government, this translates, generally speaking, to more moderate policies. Because when you have proportional representation, you usually do not win a majority, right? Because we're going to encourage not just one third party, but often multiple minor parties. So very rarely do you see one party win a majority, and therefore to govern, they have to form a coalition. I say, okay, well, we're the Republicans. We're going to work with you guys and with you guys and with you guys. Let's get together. Let's decide who we want to choose as our prime minister. Let's move on. You have to work together. So we tend to get legislation that tends to be, it has to require compromise, which can be good. But I like proportional representation a lot. But there is a downfall. Can anyone think of it? Yep. Well, that's true, but I would say that's not a problem. I mean, keep thinking. So Josh makes a good point, but that's not necessarily a problem, because that could result in legislation, again, that is more inclusive, right? That is going to, the minor party might have outsized weight, but theoretically that could still be a good thing. So you're not wrong, but there's an actual flaw, a downside for sure. I think bribery could be a problem anywhere. Keep thinking. Who do you vote for in proportional representation? People? Party. You can't vote for a person, right? Because you don't know how many people your party is going to elect. You vote for parties. So proportional representation gives huge amounts of power to the party itself, and the people don't get to choose their actual legislators. So we all vote for the parties, and then the Republican Party gets to decide, okay, we get 4 seats in this district, here's the 4 people we're going to name. Now, normally the party wants to do a pretty good job. They want to pick good people, because if they screw up, then the next election they could lose seats, and that could be sad, But the people don't have any control over the individual legislators. The parties have a lot of power. So that is a downside, that it certainly is a bit less democratic in the sense that you don't have a direct say over who represents you, just over which party represents you. On the other hand, it could be more democratic because the reflection of people's ideas is better held. Okay. So that's the two-party system. We know how the country is fragmented, or the parties are fragmented, right? We have the party in the government, the party organization, the party in the electorate. We've got all of that. So last thing I want to talk about is how parties are polarized. Again, there are lots of reasons for party polarization. We can look at the media and cable news. You can self-select, to watch only things that confirm what it is that you already believe, and so on and so forth. But the real structural reason for party polarization has to do with the way that we draw district lines, right? Who controls districting in most places? The states. And the states do it through their legislatures, which means that there's a party in power, right? So in Texas, we get 36 members of the U.S. House of Representatives, and who drew those lines for those barriers was Texas legislature. Well, who controls Texas legislature? The Republican Party, and it's true in other states where the Democrats control their, California's Democratic legislature got to draw their lines. So a party controls the drawing of lines, and you're going, okay, why does that matter? Because if I'm a party, if I'm somebody in office, and I get to help control drawing the lines for my district, how do I want to draw the lines? Do I want to draw nice, competitive, like, evenly balanced districts? No. Well, of course you're going to gerrymander, but how are you going to gerrymander? You're going to gerrymander to create safe districts, right? Like, there are different circumstances in which you would gerrymander only for your party, but if you had to work with either party a little bit, you could still gerrymander, like, to benefit incumbents. It's very complicated. But the point is, no matter how we're gerrymandering, we're going to do it to create safe districts, because the people in power have an incentive to stay in power. So they're going to draw districts that are significantly majority Democratic or significantly majority Republican, and that's called a safe district. Now think hard. This is a slightly difficult question. If I draw safe districts, then when is the outcome, as in the person, when is the outcome of the election decided? Well, when I draw the districts, I determine the outcome of the party who will win. But when is the person who will win decided? In the primary, right? If it's a safe district, does the general election decide anything? No, we already, like Bill Flores, we already know whoever the Republican is going to win when our district votes, right? So safe districts are not decided in the general election when it's one party versus the other, because it's been gerrymandered for one party to have a strong majority. So in safe districts, the outcome of the election is decided in the primary. Well, who votes in the primaries? I'm sorry? Okay, but who votes in the primary? Is it a lot of people or not very many people? Not very many. And if not very many people are voting, who's voting? Extremists, not just Republicans, because this happens in Democratic primaries too. It's extremists, right? Well, and also extremely love government teachers or whatever, and their students, obviously. No, so it's mostly extremists. So if the primary decides the outcome of the election, then does the legislator have an incentive to be moderate or to be extreme? To be extreme, because the way they're going to win is by winning the primary. That's the way they know they're going to win their seat. And so this polarization, the fact that the Republican Party in government is becoming more and more conservative, and the Democratic Party in government is becoming more and more liberal, has to do with the way we draw districts in this country, right? Because when we create safe districts, there is really no incentive for compromise. Because to get reelected, I need to be more extreme, not more moderate. Any questions about that? Theoretically, but only if enough people are willing to vote not for their party. Like, think about how many Democrats didn't like Hillary Clinton but voted for her anyway because they would never vote for a Republican. And how many Republicans did not like Donald Trump but voted for him anyway because they would never vote for a Democrat, right? So theoretically, yes, it does. If we push to the extreme, it leaves the room for a third party in the middle. But then that gets into other factors about the two-party system, which is like this long history tradition. People don't want to pick a party that doesn't win. People don't want to people feel this strong sense of identity with their party that they think is theirs. So probably not. But maybe. There's always hope. I would really love for our country to become more competitive and to see minor parties. All that would be really exciting. I'm trying to make sure how much time I have. 3 whole minutes. So in 1 minute, let's just talk very briefly about half of the effects of voting for minor parties. So minor parties officially is what it's called, not third parties, because there's more than one of them, so there's more than just 3 parties in this country. But so the first time, all we're going to talk about before we're going to stop, because I have 3 minutes, is what is the short-term effect of voting for a minor party? First of all, does it mean you win? No. When you vote for a minor party, you're not going to win. But worse than that, the short-term, please make sure you include those words short-term. The short-term effect of voting for a minor party is something called the spoiler effect. So, quick example. In 2000, Al Gore was the Democrat, George W. Bush was the Republican, and Ralph Nader was the Green Party guy. Okay, Ralph Nader was really successful, way more successful than most third-party candidates ever are. But all those people who voted for Ralph Nader, if he hadn't been a choice, and you'd forced them to pick between the Republican and the Democrat, who would they have preferred probably? The Democrat, right? So in effect, their vote for Ralph Nader spoiled the election for Al Gore, right? Stole away some votes that Al Gore might have otherwise gotten if Ralph Nader had not been on the ballot. So short-term effect of voting for a third party, number 1, you don't win. And number 2, probably the person who wins will be the party that you like the least, right? So the short-term effect of voting for a third party, called the spoiler effect, which benefits the party that you like the least. But we'll come back on Monday. Please make sure we start here and talk about the long-term effects, because although the short-term effects of voting for third parties are pretty bad, the long-term effects are pretty good. Okay, we'll stop it.